Okay, and we're live. Amazing. Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to spotlight myself annoyingly now just for the live stream. Hello, hello. I'm so excited to introduce everyone to our final session of Health Equity Week of Action, which feels quite sad, honestly. But there will be more to look forward to. So fear not if you have joined and loved it, or if you didn't get a chance to join, not to worry. I'm hoping you're having a chance to watch these recordings. And we'll, of course, be thinking of other exciting programming that we can create for you. And oh, let's get recordings in. Okay, people are coming in. Um, Hi, everyone. So I want to take a moment to, like every other session, reorient us back to the week. So our committees here at AMSA, which I'll introduce, have very thoughtfully chosen abolitionist medicine as our framework. And I know I mention in every video how, and every recording how you've heard this time and time again, but I think that's the way that we best, learn and get excited and get passionate is by kind of repeating important information, repetition, 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 right? Like we know from our Anki cards if you use that. But all of that to say, abolitionist medicine allows us to think compassionately and think with advocacy oriented strategies towards dismantling violent, oppressive systems of harm. This definition is something that we've been talking about time and time again this week, but it can look different, and it has looked different with every day that we've introduced to you here. So whether we've talked about, introducing moral medicine like we are today, whether we've talked about race-based medicine like we will today and we have earlier this week, whether we've talked about trauma-informed care like we did on Wednesday, no matter the topic that we have brought into each session, we've been focused on socially just movements that work to increase access to care and uplift marginalized and stigmatized communities. And that can look, though different in every specialty or every field, they're united in that way, right? We're affirming the lives of all patients, affirming the experiences of all patients. And in doing so, we create a more cohesive, a more strong, a more equitable therapeutic alliance. We show up better in every way. So thank you all so much for joining in live or on the stream or watching these recordings all week long. I know that I have had such an amazing time planning this alongside the wonderful Reach Committee and our lovely Jeff and Pete. I am Danya Amadian. If you're not familiar, I'm your Civic Science Fellow. And all that means is I've had the ability and gift to support Health Equity Week of Action and some of our advocacy efforts alongside doing some exciting racial equity work through partnership with the Doris Duke Foundation. So without further ado, I want to introduce our REACH Committee Chair, who will share a little bit about what REACH is and her role. Tanushree.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's good to see lots of familiar faces on this call today. Yeah, crazy that HIWA is coming to an end. It's been a really great time meeting people from different stages of their healthcare journey. I feel like I've gotten a lot of different perspectives, a lot of guidance on like how to like make the most of my time going forward. My name is Tanushree. I'm a first-year medical student zooming in from Alabama, and I'm AMSA's REACH chair. REACH stands for Race, Ethnicity, and Culture in Health. Yeah, and it's been a great time working with Donya, and I'm so excited for our last session.
Thank you so much, Tanushree. So it really has been so wonderful to be able to work together. And I want to shout out, obviously, Michaela, who will talk about who will be speaking today. So thank you, Michaela. Stephanie Brown and Mia, like all of our wonderful REACH members, thank you. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge our lovely Jeff as well. He has helped in the helped is a light word. He has truly carried us in the conceptualization of why abolition and why now. And so I'd love to have you introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind, Jeff.
Yeah, hi everybody. Oh wait, where'd you go? I have to remove spotlight. Hold on.
Here, okay, I
There,
can
from
do it
my,
for you.
okay, oh yeah. Uh, Yeah, hi. It's good to be back with you all. I have really enjoyed this week's programming. The sessions, the speakers, the dialogue have been so powerful, so relevant, so timely, and so necessary. And I commend all of you for the work that you've done to create this week's programming. Perhaps it's because I'm biased in favor of the folks that I see in front of me, but I feel like this has been the best HIWA in several years. So congratulations on that. And I'm really grateful to be able to be here with you all tonight in this final session. I am currently at the national annual meeting of the Association of Professors of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And so these are the academic folks that are training, teaching, mentoring, and coaching and preceptoring our future obstetricians, gynecologists, family planner physicians, abortion providers, and folks who are facing right now some of the strongest forces of the authoritarian takeover that we're witnessing in real time in this country. So there's more that I can say and share from some of the conversations that we've been having through this conference that I think are particularly relevant to Health Equity Week of Action. But I'll turn it over back to you all.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Beautiful and much to unpack there. So excited for that discussion later on. I want to really highlight our lovely Michaela Wetlaws, and I think I mispronounced your last name. I'm so sorry. I got excited. I saw your face and I was like, wasn't thinking. Michaela has been pivotal in so many AMSA initiatives. If you're familiar, I know she'll take a moment to talk about herself and her work, but here at AMSA, serving in the health, policy and advocacy committees, leading various initiatives, being a really pivotal part also of HIWA, and her work being able to be showcased tonight is just a testament to how ingrained she's been in our fabric. And so I'm so excited to give you the floor, my dear.
Okay. Hey everyone, my name's Michaela. First of all, thank you to everyone who put this on. I cannot take a lot of credit, but I'm really happy to be a part of this. And yeah, so as is mentioned, I'm a fourth year medical student in Emory, kind of a fifth year, M5 because I took an extra year, and going into Med Peds. I'm also the health policy chair for AMSA. And for me, the biggest goal this year has been working to create a partnership between AMSA and LMSA, which is the Latinx Medical Student Association, and really working to amplify our voices in the immigrant space, in the immigrant health and advocacy space. And so that's really one thing we're working on. And I have a couple of close friends who are part of LMSA, and we really have a lot of shared values and interests. And so hopefully that's something that we see in the coming years. Because I mean, one of the biggest strengths of AMSA is how like unified people can be from across the country, and with AMSA, it's across the globe. And I think by joining forces, we can have even more impact. So, but today's talk, it's called Medicine and Racism, how the scientific and medical fields created and perpetuated race-based medicine that harms individuals and communities. Oh, I forgot to change the date, clearly. Oh, no, I didn't. It's the right date. So I actually gave this talk about a year ago, a similar talk, to law students and law professors because I was in a medical legal partnership elective. And one of the motivations for giving this specific talk was realizing that oftentimes medicine in the medical field is seen as this objective measure, and that things like racism, discrimination, like don't really touch it, or that it's not really involved. Maybe medicine is influenced by it, but they're often seen as unrelated. And from a lot of things that I've learned throughout medical school, prior to medical school, doing my own research, that is very clearly not the case, as I'll be showing. So to the right, you see a photograph of Carl Linnaeus's plants. So he is known as the father of taxonomy for both plants and animals. But as we will see, he is also has a role in what we'll be talking about. Let's see if I can get this right. Okay. Okay, so I want to first of all recognize Edwin Lindo, who was really the inspiration for a lot of the content that is included, or if not most of the content in this. So he's a professor at UW Medicine, and his work involves racialized medicine, race and racism within medicine. And he is interested in how we think about medicine and medical training, both from medical students and residents and beyond, from a critical race theory perspective, and what that means about what our training should look like. I had the chance to have a conversation with him and two of what will now be the Med Peds directors at Emory. And hearing his perspectives was incredibly inspiring and important. I first read about him when he, in the paper for the Case for Health Reparations, which he co-authors, which I recommend checking out. And then he also created the Praxis podcast, which essentially connects theory and practice for achieving health justice. And like I said, a lot of this content in this podcast is also things that I'll be going over today. Okay. So first, I kind of want to talk about race and racism. And when I say racism, I mean the combination of power and prejudice and how that plays out in our laws, policy, employment, and healthcare. So typically we think of race and racism and its effects within science and medicine. But what I want to encourage people to do, and what I personally have gone on sort of a journey doing, is understanding how science and medicine created this biologic race, and how scientific concepts and data have been used to create and justify the racism that we see in our institutions, and how this has led to what is now a buzzword of social determinants of health. I think oftentimes the term social determinants of health is thrown around without an explanation as to why these social determinants of health exist. It's essentially explaining a disparity without explaining the underlying issues and the root cause. And racism and discrimination is a huge part of the disparities that we see. Okay, so back to Linnaeus. So the Linnaeus essentially created it was the first time they created this notion of race in the terms of, in scientific terms. So the notion of race was being given this scientific basis. So Linnaeus put forth this theory that you have four races: Europaeus, I'm going to pronounce these wrong, Americanus, Asiaticus, and Africanus. And if you read the descriptions, and these are some of the descriptions, but there's more of each, there's a very clear hierarchy and superiority, putting white individuals, white Europeans at the top, and Africans and Black individuals at the bottom. So Europeanness race was described as like sanguine, muscular, plenty of yellow hair, blue eyes, protected by tight clothing, governed by rights. And then if you look at the descriptions of the Africanus race as described by Linnaeus, it's phlegmatic, lazy. He describes women as having swollen lips, women with elongated labia, breasts lactating profusely. He describes this quote race as being lazy, neglectful, and governed by choice or caprice. And so here what you have is science being used during that time often as a justification for what a lot of white individuals believed was God's belief in the superiority of white people. And really what Linnaeus does is he uses science to create and perpetuate the sexualization and degradation of Black individuals. So all the way as far back as 1758, and I'm sure prior to that, but here we have this scientific definition of race that creates this hierarchical structure. And then you also have doctors who sought to prove that these biologic race differences. So two examples that we can see this occurring is through these beliefs about pain tolerance and skin thickness. So in 1787, Dr. Benjamin Moseley, who was a English physician, he claimed that Black individuals experienced less pain. And he claimed that Black people could bear surgical operations much more than white people. And the assumption that Black individuals have a higher pain tolerance plays out in gynecology. The assumption that Black women were more suitable subjects for experimentation likely played a role in the experimental procedures that J. Marion Sims performed on Black women who were enslaved. In 1855, we have the account of John Brown, who escaped slavery, and he tells the experience of being experimented on by a Dr. Thomas Hamilton. And Dr. Hamilton wanted to prove physiological differences between Black and white people. With Brown specifically, he wanted to prove that Black skin was thicker than white skin. So in his autobiography, John Brown recalls that for 9 months, Hamilton applied blisters to my hands, legs, and feet, which bear the scars to this day. He continued until he drew up dark skin from between the upper and under one. He used to blister me at intervals of about 2 weeks. And again, Dr. Hamilton at this time was a respected physician and trusted in the Medical Academy of Georgia. So this quote, which was taken from the Case for Health Reparations, I'm going to read it just because I think that it really speaks to the underlying inherent demeaning of Black individuals and what that means. So the scientific validation of biological race justified the existence and propagation of racial hierarchy in economics, politics, social structure, and health. So essentially, it's this idea that Black individuals were fundamentally biologically different and inferior to whites, which justified a differential allocation of resources, of access to healthcare, of educational access, of the ability to get loans, ability to build credit, ability to live in certain neighborhoods. It's at the root of why we have racist policies such as redlining. So another way to look at a lot of these social inequities that we see is based in this biologic creation, and that was used sort of as a justification for the differential treatment of Black individuals compared to white individuals. So where do we see it in medicine, right? We see race adjustment in kidney function. So just as some demographic information, Black individuals make up about 13% of the US population, yet they have about greater than 35% of those in the US receiving dialysis. And again, this disparity is rooted in racism and social injustice and not in some biologic difference. So let's just take a look a little bit closer. So EGFR is also known as the estimated glomerular filtration rate, includes race as a coefficient. So the EGFR is essentially a less lengthy and expensive way of measuring kidney function, where we measure creatinine in an equation that includes or has in the past included adjustments based on age, sex, and race. These equations were based off of flawed studies from the 1970s through the 90s, where Black individuals incidentally had higher creatinine levels. And the conclusion was that the Black race was an independent predictor of kidney function. In other words, it was assumed, not studied or proven, that this was the case. And the assumption was that Black individuals had a higher average muscle mass, therefore they had higher creatinine levels, explaining why race should be in this function. So let's see where that plays out. So say you have a white woman and a Black woman who have equivalent numbers. The only difference between them is that one woman is white and one woman is Black. What that means in terms of the estimated kidney function is that if you see down here, down where the CKD EPI, that number is 18 compared to the that 18 for the white woman compared to the Black woman whose number is 21. What that essentially is saying is that based on this equation, the Black woman has better functioning kidneys. So in nephrology, a EGFR, for example, of 20 or less is the threshold for the referral for kidney transplant. So anything above 20 wouldn't meet that threshold. Anything below 20 would. So what you have is you have a failure oftentimes to diagnose early stages of chronic kidney disease and in individuals who are Black, and individuals who are Black are also less likely to be referred to for kidney transplant. There was a recent study by the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which showed that removing race, the race coefficient, would reclassify 3.1% of Black patients from an EGFR of greater than 20 to that of less than 20, making them eligible for a transplant referral. We also see the racialization of lung function. So some history. Thomas Jefferson essentially declared deficient lung function in Black individuals, essentially as a means to justify slavery. And this was in 1785. In the 1850s, you had Samuel Cartwright, who studied oxygen metabolism and diseases that he considered, he was a plantation owner, and he studied these diseases that he considered unique to those who were enslaved. He was also the father of drapetomania, which is a psychiatric, which is a falsely created psychiatric condition that I'll cover later. But Cartwright essentially introduced race into understanding lung function. And based on his studies, he believed that there was essentially 20% deficiency in African American lungs. However, I want to acknowledge, even though Samuel Cartwright represents what a lot of the white physicians at the time were believing, and that his declaration that Black individuals had inherently poorer lung function was not accepted by everyone. James McCune Smith was the first African American physician and abolitionist, and he sought to debunk medical racism. He disputed that racial differences in longevity were inherently biological and suggested that these socioeconomic factors were responsible. One of the quotes he has is, he says, "There are sufficient grounds for the belief that these slaves, under all their disadvantages, would, if freed from slavery, attain a longevity not very much below that attained by European American population." Other individuals, including Kelly Miller, who was a mathematician, and W.E. Du Bois, also staunchly opposed the notion of a biological explanation to try and argue for the inferiority of Black people. Okay, so let's see how this plays out in lung function. So spirometry is a way to evaluate lung function. So it can look at things including COPD, asthma, disease progression. It's also involved in disability estimates, pre-employment physicals. And the notion that Black or other non-white individuals had poor lung function than whites was further cemented by faulty studies in the 1920s that came to the same conclusion. Yet these studies failed to take into consideration the environment and other factors such as occupation impacting lung function results. But nevertheless, race was included in a similar way that race was included into the kidney function test. It was included into spirometry. So essentially what happens is when someone does a spirometry test, there's a correction factor of 10 to 15% for Black patients and 4 to 6% for Asian patients. And what that means, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, is that you have potentially missed lung dysfunction, and you have also potentially missed lung diagnoses. So when two different equations were used to measure lung functioning, one that was considered race neutral was compared to one that was race and ethnicity specific. And the interpretation of someone's lung functioning changed based on whether race was included, with the underdiagnosis of any impairments in Black patients in the function that had race included in it. And again, I want to emphasize that there is no known gene location that can explain racial disparities in lung function. But what actually does impact lung function, things like body proportion, occupational hazards, environmental pollution, and lung disease. This is the case. I'm going to skip through this just for time, but this just gives essentially an example of what the essentially underdiagnosis of conditions related to lung function can, how that can play out in patients' lives. So another way that race has been within our functioning is in the adjustment of a measure for prenatal testing called alpha-fetoprotein. I'm going to try to share this. So let me see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so then I can share the online videos. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
sounds great.
Okay. So let me.
As long as that, I think, yeah, you should be able to be good with the audio. Let's see.
Okay. So let's see if I can get it on.
You're doing great.
Mhm. Okay. Now let me. Share. Okay. Can y'all see this screen?
Yes, we can see.
Right. Okay. So now let me see. I'm going to.
I love this guy. He's everywhere.
Yeah. So this is Joel Baravel, and he is a medical student. He's also known as a medical myth buster. I've been following him for a couple years now, and he really explains these medical myths that are based in race and how they play out in our healthcare system. So let's see. I'm going to try and see if we can.
Study published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2023 looked at.
So let me see if I can refresh the page. Okay.
In a common prenatal screening blood test that's offered to nearly every pregnant person. My name is Joel, the medical mythbuster, and let's talk about racial bias with the alpha-fetoprotein test. Alpha-fetoprotein, or AFP, is a protein produced by the liver of a fetus in utero. Levels of AFP in the blood are measured in order to test if a woman's pregnancy has increased risk for conditions like Down syndrome, trisomy 18, or neural tube defects like spina bifida. For the past several decades, laboratories have routinely adjusted the concentration of AFP for Black mothers by 10%. But not for any other race. Because abnormal AFP levels can point to genetic disorders or neural tube defects in babies, adjusting the AFP levels in Black mothers could have led to spina bifida diagnosis being missed, or incorrectly indicating that a child is going to have Down syndrome. This study, published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology in 2023, looked at over 43,000 mothers. It found out there was no difference between maternal serum AFP levels between Black and non-Black pregnant people when adjusted for maternal weight and gestational age. That means race-based adjustment for this test makes no sense and should be discontinued. It's yet another example of the many videos I've made about race-based medicine, and how using race as a proxy for genetics and biology is inaccurate. Including race in clinical calculations can reinforce biases and even racism. There's a racial adjustment.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, y'all can see the presentation again?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So that again was one example. Another one, so in this scenario where skin color matters, it's been ignored. So I won't play the whole video, but I really encourage you to go check it out. But essentially, since the 1970s, people have found that pulse oximeters, which can measure the oxygen content of blood, overestimate the oxygen content in individuals with darker skin. And you can imagine the repercussions of that. It can mean that someone whose oxygen levels are dangerously low does not get recognized, and they get undertreated. Again, another area in which skin color, where it matters, is ignored is dermatology. And from 1996 to 2005, there are only about 2% of teaching events at the American Academy of Dermatology that focus on skin color. And when it comes to studies on skin of color and their representation, less than 5%, in one study, it showed that less than 5% of dermatological articles on skin of color were from high impact dermatology journals. So let me say that again, because I kind of said that weirdly. That less than 5% of dermatological articles on skin of color were on skin of color from high impact dermatology journals. Okay, that's a lot of dermatology to pronounce. And then another study showed that only 4.5% of images with skin of color were made up general medicine textbooks. And also to the right, I wanted to share a resource that's called Black and Brown Skin, which is a platform that showcases clinical signs of disease in Black and brown skin. And essentially what you have is this inadequate representation of skin of color. And it's just one of the numerous examples of institutional racism within medical education. And I can give you an example at my own medical school, where it wasn't until a couple of years ago that lecturers were required to include skin of color in their lectures. And this is a problem throughout medical schools across the country. So summing this up, there's a really good article written in the New York Times by Linda Villarosa that talks about myths about physical racial differences and how they were used to justify slavery. So I want to read just part of that quote, because I think it really gets to the issue that I'm speaking about. So she writes, "The centuries-old belief in racial differences in physiology has continued to mask the brutal effects of discrimination and structural inequities, instead placing the blame on individuals and their communities for statistically poor health outcomes. Rather than conceptualizing race as a risk factor that predicts disease or disability because of a fixed susceptibility conceived on shaky grounds centuries ago, we would do better to understand race as a proxy for bias, disadvantage, and ill treatment." So again, going back to what we have in the 1750s as this creation of race, going back to the foundation upon which race was created, one that under the objective guise of medicine and science was allowed to occur for the deliberate creation and perpetuation of dangerous and harmful stereotypes in order to maintain white supremacist power structures. So now I kind of want to move to how we see race and racism playing out in psychology, psychiatry, and mental health. So as I had mentioned, or briefly sort of touched on, Samuel Cartwright, who had done experiments on lung functioning, also created this term drapetomania. Drapetus meaning a runaway slave, and mania meaning madness or frenzy. And Cartwright described a psychological disorder that, quote, caused the phenomenon of enslaved Blacks to run away from bondage. He also insisted on whipping the devil out of them, meaning the escaped slave, as a preventative measure. So here you have this direct relation to the white supremacist interest in maintaining slavery, maintaining the oppression of Black bodies and Black individuals, and under the guise of science, of medicine. Another example, in 1883, there is a guy named Francis Galton who supported eugenics, but he's also recognized for introducing the nature versus nurture idea. He had significant contribution to the scientific study of psychology and the correlation statistic. However, if you understand what his potential motivations were, he was someone who wanted to promote the white race as a superior race. And eugenics is based in that, in creating the best genetics for what's considered like the superior race. And it was interesting to kind of learn more about how a lot of our prominent statisticians, a lot of these prominent statisticians and scientists that we know for their creation of specific principles also had the motivation in part to prove that the white race was superior. So this is a quote from an interesting article that I found that says, the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis to interrogate data and understand the world were developed by white supremacists for the express purpose of demonstrating that white men are better than other people. So again, we have this distortion of scientific and medical principles for a very specific purpose of degrading Black individuals and lifting up white supremacist ideology. So let's kind of take a look, jump forward into the 1950s, where during this time, mental illness such as schizophrenia, although it's was known as a slightly different disease at that time, and it was known as a sort of white illness in the 1950s. And here we see two examples. On the left, there's this ad for Thorazine, which is a psychiatric medication. And the idea is that when white women who have been placed in institutions, by taking Thorazine, they can essentially improve their emotional stress and end up back in the home, which you see in the photo on the right. There is a person, Metzl, who writes that at this time, schizophrenia was seen as this emotional disharmony affecting white people's ability to think and feel. And again, this shift, which I'll show in the next slide, there's a shift that happened of mental illness being shifted towards Black Americans, especially Black men, in the following decades. So what we had then is in the 50s, you see psychiatric medications being advertised for white women. In the 60s and 70s, during the civil rights movement, you have the pathologizing of Black behaviors. In 1968, the psychiatrists Walter Bromberg and Frank Simon described this condition in which the rhetoric of the Black Panther movement led Black men to have violent delusions, anger, and hostility. Essentially, they were trying to pathologize individuals seeking of liberation. You had the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia in Black Americans during this time. And Jonathan Metzl writes in he's a cultural critic and a psychiatrist. He writes in one of his books about how schizophrenia became a Black disease. He writes that pharmaceutical advertisements, which I will show, shamelessly called on long-held racist tropes to promote the message that social problems raised by angry Black men could be treated at the clinical level with antipsychotic medications. So no more prominently do we see that in this ad, which I just want to read you a description of it from Arturo Baiocchi in his Racialization of Mental Illness article, where he says, describing this ad, the deranged Black figure literally shakes his fist at the assumed physician viewer, while in the background, a burning urban landscape appears to directly reference the type of civil strife that alarmed many in the establishment at that time. The ad compels psychiatrists to conflate Black anger as a form of threatening psychosis and mental illness. Indeed, the ad seems to play off presumed fears of assaultive and belligerent Black men. And here is another example, of this play between this white Western psychiatry and associated with African culture and Black Americans has a sort of primitive nature. And here's an ad for Thorazine, literally comparing it to what in this article says the basic tools of primitive psychiatry, which are really cultural emblems rooted in different African cultures. And if you remember, this is talking about Thorazine in this particular ad to essentially cure, let's see if I can can't really zoom in, but essentially it's advertising Thorazine to cure violent, belligerent behaviors of Black men. And if you recall in the previous slide, just 10 years earlier, Thorazine is being advertised to help white women get back into the house or get back into the home. So then you have this pathologization of race, and then it moves to, we see the movement of that to criminalization. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the Central Five, but the Central Five happened in 1989. It was a case where 5 teenagers, 4 of which were Black and 1 was Hispanic, were accused and now exonerated of raping a woman in New York City in Central Park. The language around what was used to describe these individuals, they were described as wilding and wolf pack, and they essentially led to what was termed by someone as being representative of a super predator. The super predator was this term that became a part of mainstream media at the time, and it was even used on shows like the Oprah Winfrey segment on Good Morning America. And it was this term that specifically was speaking about young Black men, Black teenagers, Black boys, and the need to somehow reel in or control these violent behaviors that reportedly these individuals had. There are clips that you can even see of Hillary Clinton talking about this term super predator. And they serve as an example of how the objectivity of medicine and science has been used to perpetuate the same racialized, dehumanizing stereotypes that were introduced in the 18th century. In other words, it's not a coincidence that we have something such as this come up, understanding our history. And again, sort of since the foundation of this country, the ways in which Black behaviors were pathologized to help justify and promote their criminalization, we can see in examples such as these. So in conclusion, I mean, there's a lot more that I could speak about, and this does not nearly cover the half of it. But in general, I want to sort of bring up the idea that in order to build a path forward, we have to start at the roots. Edward Lindo, the professor and scholar that I spoke about in the beginning, he has this analogy of tearing down a building, right? In order to tear down a building, the first step is to go to the basement and understand its foundation. And that is, I think, what the importance of understanding our history and how it plays out in what we see today, in order to sort of understand what we can do moving forward. So basically, I want to end with medicine and science can't be separated from society, including the history of and present day racism and inequity within it. Medicine and science have a direct role in racial oppression and the health inequities we see today as a result. We can see many of these inequities through social determinants of health. And then finally, by understanding and acknowledging the racism within our medical and scientific practices, we can begin to take steps necessary to uproot their hold. And this is just some additional reading, as I had mentioned before, the case for health reparations, the praxis. I also have essentially all the links to everything that I read to put this presentation together. But that is, I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. I know I'm not the only one to feel this way, and we're going to open it up here to the floor. But I want to speak for how touching it is to see someone, of your privilege too, right? With your background to come in and to speak on these matters. Jeff and I were just speaking about how important that is and how beautifully you characterized the flow, starting from, the historical roots, bringing us to present day, and how, these inequities are so embedded, and many don't know about them. I know you shared earlier how you had given this presentation to, a group of law students, right? And how different the response might be for those who are unaware. So I just want to take a moment to thank you so much for your time and your energy and the way in which you are literally personifying the fight back, right? You are living it, you are breathing it, you're studying it, and then you're out in the world doing that work and being a model, of what that looks like. So thank you. And let me, without taking over, pass the torch on to others with reflections and thoughts and questions.
I really loved your presentation. When you talked about the pulmonary function tests, we're currently in our pulmonary block right now. And I like distinctly like recall our professor telling us that like not so long ago at all, there used to be like different guidelines for like how to interpret tests depending on if a patient was like white or black. And then like he like spent like a good amount of time like explaining like why this was the case and like why it shouldn't be the case. I thought that was so like good to hear. It's like a perspective that I hadn't gotten before in like my classes, and it made me think of AMSA as well. But then the more that I was thinking about it, the more that I like can also recall like other statements that I've been told throughout like my medical education, that now I realize are just inaccurate. Like we were told that African American patients are just more salt sensitive, and I think like the which like is I think the reasoning behind it, as I learned earlier this week through HIWA, was just because like the slaves who went across on the slave trade like had just the ones who survived were ones that were able to retain more water is what I had learned. So I think just like understanding the history behind it, like you were saying, just makes it, I guess like you understand like why we do things better. And so it's more than just like a blanket statement, I guess. And so I'm definitely gonna be taking that with me. Like whenever I hear things from now on, I'm gonna like look into it a little deeper as to like, well, why is this the case? Like, and is this even like a true fact? So thank you.
I'm almost speechless. For so many reasons. First of all, Michaela, thank you for that. I don't feel like it does it justice to call it a presentation or a talk, because honestly, what we're talking about here is frankly the soul of medicine, and so it feels inadequate to refer to this as like a talk. This is the soul work that medicine needs to do, because of the truth of the history of modern medicine in the Western sense, which is rooted in the worldview and the values set of the physicians who came together in the 1800s and early 1900s to establish what has become the profession of medicine, which is its own creation, totally separate from the human history long tradition of medicine and healing. And these are the stories that absolutely need to be shared. So thank you for taking that on, for doing that work. And if I may speak so boldly, from one white embodied person to another white, this is the work that we can and should do, to share in the emotional and physical labor of interrogating our past, our present, how we got here, and and to reorient away from whiteness as a relationship to power, relationality to power, the capacity to dominate, the abuse of power. So there's so much here, and there's been so much over the course of the week that I think speaks to the incompatibility of the ideology of whiteness and ultimately a commitment to a practice of care and caring. And I might be going on a bit longer because I've had one or two glasses of wine at this point, and I'm also at the national conference of the Association of Professors of Gynecology and Obstetrics, and the talks have been real here, about both the state of things in the present moment and how we got to this present moment. And in fact, the keynote speaker this morning was Dorothy Roberts, who wrote the profoundly important book, Killing the Black Body, and which documented, the origin, effectively the origin story of obstetrics and gynecology, which is really also the origin story of the modern profession of medicine, because they were so coincident. And the unbroken lineage that we have to contend with today that connects the norms and the normatives of modern medicine as being premised upon the worldview and value set and the anthropology and the sociology and even the religiosity of white male enslaving physicians of the 1800s and early 1900s. And of course, slavery hasn't stopped because, there's the exception clause in the 13th Amendment that allows for enslavement of incarcerated people, which is absolutely ongoing. And so the carcerality even, and the intermixing of the carcerality of the prison system and the medical system and the economic system, all of that needs to be contended with. And I think that there is an absolutely essential responsibility of those of us who are racialized as white to take on a significant proportion of that work, because that is our creation. So thank you. And also, I think kudos to all of you for being strong enough in your ethical constitutions to take on issues that, frankly, elder practicing physicians are barely able to tolerate. So so I see in your in the capacity of your early introductions into the profession of medicine, the moral clarity and the willingness to speak with that kind of moral clarity, I think, is so important. I'll shut up. I think this has been so profoundly, so transformative. I feel like this is a major moment in the history of HEWA, to have been willing to take on a framework that says these systems are irredeemable, which is what Dorothy Roberts said this morning, by the way. So this is not me. I mean, I am 100% on board with that. But Dorothy Roberts herself is saying these systems are unsustainable and they are irredeemable. And she herself talked about her own evolution from a reformist position to an abolitionist position. So it's a journey that so many people, I think, are on and experience and can experience. So wherever we are in that journey, that is where we are. But this is a moment for us to really push ourselves and challenge ourselves to be particularly critical of the failure of progressive liberalism of the last 50 years to actually achieve measurable, sustainable, protected gains in human rights and civil rights, which includes racial rights, it includes gender rights, it includes transgender rights, because everything is connected, right? I mean, that's the thing I've been hearing over and over again, even at this conference. And it's a good reminder that truth has long been known by us in humans, in human societies. It is capitalism and racialism and sexism that causes us to forget our fundamental unitedness and interconnectedness. So anyway, I said I was going to shut up like 3 minutes ago, so I'm really shutting up now. But anyway.
No, I appreciate that. And I want to give, if everyone else wants to speak or ask a question before I say something. Oh, and also I saw in the comments that Hamali, yeah, so the ASN did remove the race coefficient from GFR, but I think it's important to also see that it wasn't that long ago, and that people are still being harmed by, you know, its placement in kidney functioning. I mean, just think of everyone who wasn't able to get a kidney transplant due to this. But I think yeah, last year. And I mean, with PFTs too, it's with PFTs, sorry, pulmonary function tests, lung function tests. It's still so embedded in these devices that people are having actually a hard time removing it, and that it's up to the astuteness of the clinician to decide, okay, to decide really what is happening clinically, and not relying on this solely on this value. But I wanted to just real quick kind of on the idea of like thinking about the ways in which we're taught things and then sort of the reality of it. I think one of the examples that I did not talk about at all in this presentation is the experimentation of men in the syphilis study. And I think that often is used as the sole thing for describing why Black communities don't trust white communities. It's described, as the sole thing that's sort of this sore eye on public health, yada, yada, yada. When if you actually understand all the history and all the things that I touched upon in this presentation and more, you understand exactly why we had the perfect conditions for the experimentation. I'm not calling it a study, it was an experimentation to occur. And that this whitewashing, both in the medical field, public health field of our history, allows us, or maybe intentionally keeps us from seeing the why, seeing the root of our issues, and then also keeps us from actually being able to address those issues today. So
I just want to take a moment to uplift a lot of what you just said, and also some things that Jeff mentioned. We've been talking about the GFR, and I was really glad that you brought that up, Hamali, because it's so amazing that we're finally getting to a place where things are being redacted. And I'm really glad you shared that. And I'm also really glad that you shared, Michaela, how when we think about it contextually, like we all are, of course, we think about how many lives were lost and how it's almost inconceivable that just now, recently, last year, this could be something that was recognized enough to be redacted. A similar measurement, I believe, is the VBAC, the vaginal birth after cesarean. Another measure to essentially whether or not a vaginal birth is safe for a birthing body, and how just the calculation of adding, one of the questions is just adding, their race, and there used to be a question about whether the person was Black or Hispanic, and those race correction factors, like Michaela was talking about today, would cause a huge discrepancy in the percentage scores of what that risk was. Essentially, like she mentioned, with all these other assessment tools, the clinical decision making cannot be done properly or humanely when the tools within themselves are embedded with this information. So the risk assessment that we might be, we would have been giving our patients, right? If you're not educated on these matters, like Michaela mentioned, like you're going into this not, of course, hopefully not consciously wanting to perpetuate racism, but then unconsciously, due to a lack of awareness, right, perpetuating these structures and making recommendations based upon the values that you are seeing. So really just moved by that, and moved by you, Michaela, and also Jeff. I wrote down almost every single thing that you say, which is always what happens when Jeff starts to speak. I start to type, and I just think of what I want to take away from what Jeff mentioned, and I'm sure it touched other people too, is the interrogation, right? That we need to have, that we must have as future physicians, of the past, of the present, of everything that we are put in front of us as an assessment tool, to question it, right? Every time we interact with a patient, to question all of the things, that the documentation in front of us, right? Even the ways that racism is perpetuated in the way that we talk about patients through HPIs, right? In the way, in their history of present illness. What way are we using language to marginalize populations? So how can we be interrogators bravely at every step? So anyways, thank you guys, and I'll let more room for reflections, others.
I have a question for you all that that I'm curious about. I I don't think I think all of us are probably sort of in this space united around a sort of shared curiosity about the educational system within which and behind which we are educated, trained, and enculturated into becoming physicians. I'm not sure that many other people would be showing up on a Friday evening at 7:30 Eastern time unless you weren't already kind of oriented with that sort of curiosity and self-introspection. And so one of the things that I am actually curious about to hear from people who are in the moment of their medical education to be experiencing in real time a correction of something that frankly has never been a reasonable scientific thing. I mean, our scientific racism is a misapplication of evolutionary biology, and that's always been understood. And all of the physicians who were effectively trying to justify enslavement and systems of enslavement were not basing it in actual science, right? And so, like, this is a moment of also a reckoning of our, and forgive me for using this word, but this is the word, a reckoning of our epistemology. Like the entirety of what it is that we claim to be learning and what it is that we claim to know. And I think about this in relation to you, Danya, in terms of like your fellowship as the Doris Duke Fellow, who is literally working on the undoing of the so-called race corrections, which is a fallacy, in what we call evidence-based modern medicine. And it's 2025. It isn't 1690 or even 1865 anymore. It's 2025. And so I know that this week has been about the undoing, but I'm curious about how that like I asked the question yesterday morning in a session to a group of students who had presented on what effectively the politicization of medical education, specifically around abortion care and trans-affirming care. And I asked, and of course, all these presentations are data, blah, 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 numbers, chi-squared, t-test, whatever. And I'm like, how does that make you feel? Like, this is the politicization of your education, but also the essential truth of medical education is that it's always been in the political interest of a certain ideology. And I don't know how many other people are out there asking you whether that matters to you or not, but it feels kind of important. As people who claim to be kind of about the pursuit of knowledge, truth, questioning. So anyway, that's my question to you all.
I think on that lines, I think it even more so emphasizes why, especially now, there needs to be this understanding that medicine and anyone who's in it, so medical students, physicians, nursing students, et cetera, anyone who's in the healthcare provider field, like it is not a time to be apolitical or this time to separate the medicine from whatever your, political beliefs are. I think that I mean, I've run into it. I'm sure a lot of people have run into it when trying to promote things and advocate for things at their school, that there's this hesitation to remain apolitical, to remain neutral, that even when they talk about how you should speak with patients, you have to remain neutral and sort of take whatever it is that they're telling you or saying to you. But that's just not the reality as we see in our history. And so that's almost too like this potentially like sort of intentional way to keep the structures the way they are, the kind of like stay in your lane mentality, when really the lanes were never straight. Yeah, that's all I have to say on that.
Oh, I love that. I love this so much. And, there was a part of my like toolkit slide deck that is coming to my mind right now that as you guys are speaking about this was it was a quote surrounding, was it someone else's quote or mine? I can't remember because there were so many quotes in mine, but there was this emphasis on how are we as future clinicians, and some of us here as clinicians, when we are utilizing the tools that were intended to guide us, because the definition of essentially an algorithm or an assessment is a tool to guide clinicians in decision making, like one of the most baseline definitions, to inform and guide. Those are the words that came up repeatedly for me as I was researching this. So how is it that the tools specifically intended to inform and guide are inherently violent, are inherently misogynistic, are inherently based in white supremacy, are inherently et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then how do we, within that, abandon our initial oath of do no harm, right? Like this is how can we even begin to think that we can participate in a system of care, and say that we do stand by that oath? And so, so I do think what we're talking about is so important, and this is why I love AMSA and why I love especially us doing this right now, because it's so important that we can be a space that is honest. And it's not that we're not all a little bit fearful, right? There's still an element of fear and still an element of, and we recognize that, right? Like, oh gosh, like when I say this, depending on what my audience is, right? Everyone here tonight, this is not going to shock anyone, right? But depending on who listens, who, especially our written word, things that go out on our website, right? It can be frightening, but also it can be frightening to willingly participate, consciously participate. And so I just urge us to continue to be brave, and to take refuge in our community, because there are people that feel like us, and more than are just here tonight, and more than will watch this stream. So other people, I'm sorry.
I just saw we had a question in the chat that I wanted to bring our attention to. Jan asked, has anyone here heard of or have looked into the systemic/institutionalized baked-in racism as it exists in current, I think, North American medical systems and in international medical systems?
So I think meaning as in if we're seeing similar things play out in other countries' health systems, if I'm reading that question right. I think at least from what I have done, I know that there are some of the algorithms, for example, or the equations internationally don't use race in the same way that things in the US does, but that does not by any means mean that there isn't that racism embedded. That's not sort of something that I have done a lot of digging into. But if anyone else has a response.
I'll just tune in and just say thank you so much for your question too. Um, yeah, I also, and I'm glad that you're asking this because my research is also heavily focused on the US, but I think what I have picked up a little bit on is just echoing what Michaela said, that I don't believe it's as highly utilized simply because also the history as we learned tonight, right? And also is just dating back to the Enlightenment period and a lot of essentially white people's harm right here in the US. So it's these little bit, it seems more so, at least the research is more so heavily focused on the United States. However, I think that's a really interesting thing that maybe I can add as well to my toolkit and help to provide more background on, with the support of Michaela, of course, because obviously your work has been so great.
One thing I'll add to that is just that the unique, I think the unique aspects of US based anti-Black racism has been globally exported through a US based dominant globalism. And so I'm curious but I don't know, but I'm curious about the impact of a kind of exportation of anti-Black racism that is specific to the US context. But given the sort of the global, the recent history and kind of ongoing, although starting to wane, global dominance of US culture, how much impact that has had on Black and African people's experiences of healthcare in other systems, where American anti-Black racism has perhaps had an effect. I mean, I don't know if anybody's been looking at that, but that is kind of to me, that's an interesting thing, because certainly nobody's exporting the American healthcare system. Nobody's buying this shit, but lots and lots of societies are buying American anti-Black racism.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for that context. That was beautifully worded and very true. Helps to orient us more and more. Any additional or final reflections, comments, questions?
And I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking a lot, but I only want to say that programming like this is an expression of what I think is the appropriate spirit of response to the call from what is effectively a global majority of humans to address the violence of white supremacy. And Dorothy Roberts herself this morning in the keynote address that I sat in at 8:30, I'm never up at 8:30 in the morning, but I was up for Dorothy Roberts to hear her, that's for sure. She spoke about the necessity to contend with our history. It's the only way we're going to understand where we are. And it can be really hard. And it's awful, awful violence. I mean, and it's wild how extensive it is when we think about the intersection of the development of modern Western style medicine and the violence, racialized violence, gender violence, violence against people who are economically marginalized. Just those histories are so intertwined, and we're so terrified to address it. But the only way we can get free from it is to actually address it. So this is just the fantastic culmination of a really important week of action, health equity, in the name of health equity, towards health equity.
I mean, can you host, Jeff? You basically are.
No, that's not my role. That's your role. This is a student-led organization. I'm just here to cheerlead and help you and support you all. But yeah, I mean, you all have done this. So I'm going to shut up.
No, never need to shut up. That was beautiful. I'll take a moment now. Or maybe here, what I'll do, I'll co-spotlight myself, even though I don't want to. You like my Kim Possible ringtone, everyone? This is also, I do this spotlight for when I can for the stream too, so everyone can kind of have a embodied voice that's coming in. Thank you so much. There's something I'm about to put in the chat, but I love that line. The only way we can get free from it is to actually express it. And isn't that so true about so many other structures of violence that we witness in our lives? So thank you so much. As we begin to close out our talk tonight, please continue to utilize the chat, or Michaela, if you would be willing to place your contact information maybe in the chat for us. We have some beautiful comments. I'd love to read them out if y'all are okay with that. Hamali said, this has been such a fantastic week. Thanks so much for bringing so many inspiring speakers together. I've learned so much. Oh my gosh. Rena, thank you, Michaela, for your time and being here with us to talk about race-based medicine and its history. I learned a lot and will reflect on what has been spoken about today as I begin my medical school education. That makes me emotional. You're starting out and knowing these things now, so important. Also appreciated Jeff's reflections. Yes, it's reassuring to know that there are physicians like you and future physicians who share these values. Thank you so much, you guys. This has been such an incredible, and I'll let Michaela also say goodbye to everyone, but I just want to say it's been such an incredible week of action. Action begins in this other classroom, right? In this classroom that we're developing here together, of learning about the roots, learning about history, learning about how we can respond. So we thank you for joining us all week long, and we hope to give you future events like this that allow us to turn towards what is difficult, like Jeff mentioned, because it is our moral responsibility, especially given the privilege of studying medicine. So I will first give it off to Michaela, and then maybe to Nusri if you want to say something as well after Michaela.
No, thank you all so much for taking your time on this Friday afternoon / evening. I really appreciate it. And the only thing that I'll, I guess, add or say is just to continue to be curious and ask the questions, and ask the questions of your peers, ask the questions of whoever you deem your superiors. You know, if you're not sure why something is being done, like, ask. I think that's where it starts, and expecting that, you know, not expecting the status quo, I guess. Yeah, thanks again. Yeah.
As I pass the mic to Tanushree, I'll mention that as long as Michaela is okay with it, we'll be adding obviously this recording, and then if able, the slide deck as well. My project has been in a similar light, and as we continue to add resources, such as how to be curious with your preceptors and thoughtfully, compassionately, but firmly ask difficult questions and assess these environments. The tools will continue to be added to the AMSA landing page. There is a civic science fellow racial equity project on the landing page on the AMSA webpage, and you can continue to look there for more tools around this topic of race-based medicine. Tanushree?
Yeah, thank you guys all for being here today. Oh my gosh, now I'm spotlighted too.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. But I think I've taken like a lot from this week. It's definitely been a very new experience for me. And one of the biggest things that I feel like I've taken to heart is the importance of having a community who's like willing to like educate you on like what you are just like unaware of. And like being willing to do that in a way that's like kind and understanding, and like encourages you to ask questions. And I'm hoping, like, I'm so glad to have that with AMSA, and I'm hoping to find that community like where I live as well. And I think what you said, Michaela, is perfect. The way to do that is just to start by asking questions, and to be, I guess, like unafraid to take that first step and like speak what you believe. And then as one of our earlier speakers, Dr. Russian, told us, the more you put yourself out there, the more your people will come and find you. So that's just what I'm holding on to this week.
That's beautiful. They exist. I promise. I'll take you off Spotlight. No worries. I'll take everyone off Spotlight. How's that? Thank you so much. Okay, all. I do want to give one more shout out to Jeff. Jeff, thank you for all of your support.
You're
And
you're so welcome. You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure.
thank you. And to each of you being here tonight, thank you, Hamali, Irina, Jan, everyone, everyone tuning in. It's been wonderful to have you this week and beyond. So be on the lookout for more from us. And until then, have a wonderful, thoughtful, curious weekend. Bye, everyone.